now, I think, the chair of two health trusts in London. You did it in Birmingham before. How much do you think the disruption was yesterday with the nurses' strike, ambulance strike next week? How worried are you about the impact upon patient safety?
Well, in my trusts, actually, the nurses didn't strike because they didn't reach the threshold in terms of the ballot. But there were a quarter of trusts across England alone where nurses took strike action. It's very, very worrying. And as you say, next Wednesday, we're going to see the ambulance service in London striking as well, and potentially others to come, other staff members, junior doctors. Of course, it has an impact on the care of patients. Yesterday, there were operations cancelled, for example, and it's something that we worry about in terms of keeping services going and helping to get down the backlog, which of course grew up during the course of the grew even more during the course of the pandemic. But I also have some sympathy with those nurses who have taken a real terms pay cut over the last 10 years and who actually we have not asked an awful lot of in the last few years and continue to now. The
striking thing to me, I mean, yesterday we had the former chair of the Conservative Party, Jake Berry, who was the chair with Liz Truss, saying that the government should be kind of offering more money. I think just in terms of the wider politics, when I look back over the last 30, 40 years, Margaret Thatcher, John Major, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, David Cameron, they never ended up picking a fight with nurses. What is the politics of this, do you think? Why do you think the government has decided at this point to have this fight with that kind of group?
Well, no government wants to pick a fight with nurses because clearly the general public are always going to be on their side. Here, I think it's an interesting one because there's an independent pay review body. You've both been cabinet ministers. You know that if you have an independent pay review body give a proposal, you've got to have a pretty good reason not to accept it. Well, the government have accepted it. So in their view, they've done what they thought was the right thing. But of course, that's 5%, and inflation is now 10.7%. So naturally, people think, well, if inflation is 10.7%, my sort of cost of living is going up, and my wages aren't keeping pace with it. So you can completely understand it, not just from a nurse's point of view, but from other sectors too. But when you put in a pay demand of 19%, the justification is, well, we've lost over 20% over the last 10, 12 years, so therefore we want to catch up in one go. You can kind of see the logic from that, but realistically, no government and Labour have made it clear that they wouldn't be giving them 19% as well.
But the nurses know that too. I think the RCN, Pat Cullen was on yesterday.
That's where I think these former ministers are right. There is going to have to be some face-to-face negotiation over this.
With Steve Barclay.
Yeah, and the government are going to have to come up with something a bit better. Now, it totally undermines the whole concept of independent pay review bodies, of course.
Hasn't Dr Dan Poulter, who is a former health minister, said he's a Tory, MP, he has said that actually the pay review body should look again, because that was done, I think, back in February. The economy has changed since then. Inflation has risen. Bank of England just raised their interest yesterday. So actually, it's not current. That 5% is not a current figure. It would probably be higher if they were to look at it again today.
That's the get-out clause for the government. Because if they want to get a solution, that's the way to do it.
I was surprised.
Is to say, let them look at it again.
I was surprised Steve Barclay ended up in a hard-line stance with the head of the Nurses' Union earlier in the week. Weren't you a bit surprised by that?
Do you know him?
I wonder whether or not, and I do remember this from my time in government, when quite rightly Gordon was holding a tough line on public spending. It's quite difficult for a single cabinet minister to go out of line with a pay policy that's been set across government. And the trouble is, as you say, Ranveer, we're in a period of inflation. It's all very well for independent pay review bodies to say something, but then it gets out of kilter with the way in which inflation is going.
It's out of date very quickly.
This is a culmination of a lot of years of people, particularly in the public sector, feeling that their pay has been falling.
It was interesting. Ranveer was asking about sympathy earlier.
Yeah.
And actually, when you look at what was being said yesterday, the NHS says, well, it's OK because we're going to have Christmas levels of provision during the strikes, because there's less operations at Christmas, less routine procedures. That was quite reassuring. And you can sort of see the public understanding that. Whereas when it comes to the train strikes, I mean, Christmas provision. I mean, Christmas is the point where people are doing loads of journeys on the roads as well. And you suddenly wonder whether the nurses have got the public on side. What's happening with the rail workers?
I think the public
Mick Lynch will tell you.
I think public support, I don't think they get that. Look-alike.
I got it, but I thought it was baldest.
No. He has been publicly confused for Mick Lynch.
No, have you?
Oh, yes.
That's got to be tricky.
Mick Lynch would not wear that tie.
Head of the RMT.
And he has been mistaken for me, which he didn't like.
Did he not? We've got to get to Dr. Amir, but go on, make your point, Ian. I
can't remember what it was now.
OK,
I
fine.
was asking you whether the rail workers are going to lose public sympathy.
Yes.
Different from the nurses.
Anecdotally, people that phone into my radio show on this, they still have a lot of sympathy with the RMT case. But I wonder if these strikes are still going on by the time we come back after the New Year in January the 9th or whatever.
The RMT ones.
I just wonder whether people will have got a bit more fed up with it.
What's fascinating to me is that the RMT, I think, have been offered, or the rail workers have been offered sort of 8% over 2 years, 4% one year, 4% the next. You know, someone like Pat Cullen at the RSN would probably think about that. You know, in Scotland, she did that negotiation. She's looked at 7.5% up to 11%. You know, it's interesting that the rail workers, who are generally paid better than nurses, aren't accepting 8%.
And yet, they are. Well, TSSA have accepted
you were saying, weren't you, a couple of the unions
and that has slightly undermined the RMT position.
Yes. Right, let's talk to Dr. Amir as well. Good morning to you, Dr. Amir. We were talking and reflecting, of course, on what the impact yesterday was of the nurses' strike and what it might be next time. But actually, on the front of the Times this morning, they're saying that the ambulance strike is set to pose the biggest threat of all. And there's a line in here that I think makes my blood run cold a little bit. It says, in the first deal reached between an ambulance trust and the GMB union, heart attack and stroke patients will get an ambulance only if treatment is deemed time critical. I mean, in which circumstances is a heart attack and a stroke not time critical? This is deeply worrying, isn't it, that ambulance workers will be going on strike? I think it's next Wednesday.
Morning. It is deeply worrying, and heart attacks and strokes are really time critical, because the sooner you get treatment for those kind of things, the better the outcomes are. I think what's important to say is, yes, absolutely, the ambulance strike is going to have a huge impact on patients and the NHS, and we need to look at what's being done to mitigate that. More importantly, we need the government to come in and talk to the unions and discuss pay, not just work conditions, which seems to be what they're saying, but it has to be pay and how to improve pay, as well as work conditions and staffing levels. I think people who are watching this will be worried about the ambulance strike next week. It's important to say that if you do have a life-threatening emergency, still dial 999. They are prioritising category 1 and 2 illnesses, and that is things like heart attacks and strokes and life-threatening emergencies. There may be a longer wait because of the strike, but the aim really between now and Wednesday is to avert the strike through negotiations, and that falls to the government to act.
Well, and let me just point out a couple of other stories that are around this morning, which are all related, of course, to that. Front of the Daily Telegraph, the NHS on high alert for flu outbreak. Hospital admissions for flu have jumped by 40%. At the same time, I got a text message from my own GP surgery saying that, I'm afraid today we're only going to be dealing with emergencies because we've reached our safe working limits because of sickness of clinicians. Please speak to a pharmacist first. And we're also dealing with a high number of strep A illnesses from concerned patients. You would think if that were to happen on the same day as the ambulance strike, where would a parent go with a child? You can't go to your GP because they've said we're not taking anything other than emergencies. You can't walk into A&E because, you know, it's just a... For us out here, it's a frightening situation, I think.
Yeah, and I think all of this is a consequence of, a decade worth or more of poor funding, poor staffing within the NHS, and we're now seeing the symptoms of that. Plus, the impact of COVID that's had as well. It is a really difficult time to be a patient. It's a difficult time to be a clinician. The entire NHS, primary, secondary, and tertiary care, is all under intense pressure, and there is a lot of staff sickness, whether that's due to stress or we've got the same winter viruses and bacteria affecting us as clinicians, meaning that we can't go to work and spread it around there. So it's a really, really difficult time. But the message remains
clear. Would you expect COVID to have pushed up flu outbreaks this year?
Yeah, yes, we've had 2 winters where we've been not socially mixing, so that our immune system might be a bit flu naive. So that is one of the theories as to why flu admissions have gone up 40% in the last week. That's 8 times what we expect at this time of year. But at the same time, there are lots of other winter viruses and bacteria going around, which you can get more than one infection at the same time, and that is very, very makes people very unwell.
Dr. Amir, just briefly, because we're slightly running out of time, but just about, I know lots of parents are still worried about strep A. I think the deaths are at 18 now for children in the UK. What can pharmacies do? There's word that they could give an alternative antibiotic. Just a quick word on that, just for reassurance to our viewers, please.
Yeah, as always, if strep A is a very susceptible bacteria to a number of antibiotics. So if one has run out, penicillin or amoxicillin, there are lots of other ones that we can give you. So either talk to your GP or your pharmacist about that, and we can work together to get the right treatment for you and your child.